Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Chak Wing Museum. My name is Craig Barker. I am the Head of Public Engagement for the museum. I'd like to begin firstly by acknowledging that we are meeting today on Gadigal land. We are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that I personally and the Chak Wing Museum wishes to acknowledge and pay our respect to the traditional custodians of the lands, sea and air in which we meet today in modern Sydney, and acknowledge that it is unceded territory as well. Thank you for joining us at the Chak Wing Museum for this month's lunchtime talk. We've got an exciting program of events and activities right throughout March. They're all accessible on our website if you'd like to know more, but I will mention in passing on the evening of Thursday the 16th of March our collaboration with the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens with the film screening of the documentary film about archaeologists working in Kifera, titled in English, titled as Inhabiting Summers of History. And you're most welcome to register for that event. We've also, on the 30th of March, another Thursday evening, have a panel discussion by a number of artists called Seduction of the Sea, and this is related to our exhibition Coastline Downstairs. But today we're going to be focusing on the archaeology of Britain, and it's my double honour to introduce our presenter today, not just in terms of personally really looking forward to an exciting talk, but also to acknowledge how one of our own has gone on to great success as well. So it's very, very exciting to have Sam back. Dr. Samantha Leggett is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow and a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. She's involved through the fellowship with a research project looking at Vikings and fish, and is also lecturing at the university, specialising in a number of topics, including isotopic analysis, early medieval European archaeology, and computational archaeology as well. She is, as I mentioned, an alumna of the University of Sydney, having graduated here following studies in archaeology, medieval studies and immunology, and left Sydney to work on her doctorate at the University of Cambridge, which she completed in 2020, looking at diet and migration in early medieval Europe. So it's fascinating to see your career trajectory and both from your doctoral research and now into your professional career, looking at this relationship between humans in Britain and in northwestern Europe, and that relationship between diet and so on. So without me blabbering on anymore, it's my great privilege to introduce Sam. Sam's talk represents the beginning of a long-term relationship between the University of Sydney and the University of Edinburgh in terms of archaeology, and I know that Sam will refer to this in her presentation. No pressure, Sam, but of course you're following in the footsteps of one of the University of Sydney's most famous and most important alumni, which of course was Gordon Chau, who would go on to become Professor of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. So there's already been a long connection between the two institutions, but the forthcoming years promise to be very, very exciting. Welcome, Dr. Sam Leggett. We're the Anglo-Saxons vegetarian. Old bones meet cutting-edge science. Thank you, Sam.
Well, thank you so much, Craig, and yes, so nice to be back in a place that I know and love so well, and particularly nice to be back to be in the Chak Wing Museum, because when I left, it wasn't fully built yet; it was under construction. So gorgeous, gorgeous space, and lovely to be here. As Craig mentioned, there is this particularly strong relationship between Edinburgh and Sydney, and over the forthcoming couple of years, we're going to be doing lots of workshops, particularly working with Professor Roland Fletcher. And my boss, Dr. Manuel Fernandez-Gotz, looking at urbanism, climate change, sustainability, and how archaeology can look at the human past and look at ways forward through the current climate crisis. But today I am going to be speaking about some work I've done looking at early medieval people and their diets using isotopic analysis. And if anyone needs to find me on social media, that is my Twitter handle down there at the bottom. So I would also just like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that we are giving this talk today on unceded land. And just a trigger warning that because I am talking about bioarchaeology, some slides in this presentation do contain images of human remains or extracts thereof. There is one slide that has this on there, and that is collagen extracted from human remains, but I've tried to avoid images of burials for this talk. So my particular strand of bioarchaeology really focuses on what people eat and how that gets into your bones and your bodies, and then the stories that can tell us about people in the past. And I found that this quote from a French gastronomer was particularly sort of engaging for this. Tell me what you eat and I will tell you what you are. And this is what I try to sort of put into any of these unknown persons that we look at in bioarchaeology. Have a look at the chemical signatures in their remains and try to work out who they are and what that can tell us about their lives and their cultures. So this talk is sort of a distillation of two recent papers that came out from myself and a colleague, Tom Lambert. And so if you want to sort of breed in the very boring detail about how isotopes work and how all the calculations that I'm going to sort of show you on these slides today, those are links there for that. And when these came out last year, it created a bit of a furor. Which was very unexpected. Tom and I were doing this sort of classically academic thing of had this long sort of discussion and put these two papers out, and we were very pleased with ourselves, but we didn't think it would go very far. But everybody really liked this. I don't know what it was about the news cycle at the time. And I quite like being called a boffin by The Sun. But it was quite interesting for us to see that no matter how carefully you craft a press release, people will certainly take very specific things out of it, no matter how much you try to be a really good scientist and have it nice and cut and dry and there's no room for misinterpretation. Everybody clung onto this idea of the fact that they were flexitarians or vegetarians, and that this was, you know, a very shocking thing to see. Certainly it was interesting for us to find, but we didn't really think that the general public would be so shocked. And that vegetarianism was the term that everybody decided to use, and hence the title of my talk for today. And all of this started when I was giving a sort of work in progress talk at Cambridge to the history faculty. I was in archaeology, and Tom came along, and I was sort of talking about the fact that all of the data that I had, nobody looked like they were very heavy meat eaters. And this shocked him. And Tom's a specialist in early medieval history, particularly looking at law codes and things, and he's like, but all of the texts that we have say that they were eating a lot of meat, particularly the elites. So why on earth aren't you finding people who are eating a lot of animal products? What on earth is going on here? And I'm like, oh, that's not that surprising. This is quite common for isotopes. And he went, okay, but I think historians would be really interested to see this. Let's collaborate and try to disentangle everybody's assumptions about this topic. And so then, because it was Cambridge, there was lots of lovely, nice dinners and free tea and coffee in his very swanky common room at Sydney, Sussex. And we did some very boring mathematics about exactly what these law codes tell us about what they're eating. And this all basically boils down to this one very, very big assumption that everybody was eating a lot of meat, particularly the elites. And this has been persistent both in the archaeological record and the historical record, and no one's actually tried to test this. It comes from only a small strand of text, but it is a very pervasive myth that, particularly in this period after the Romans and up to the Norman conquest, everybody was just consuming a lot of animal carcasses. And certainly if you were elite, this was absolutely the expectation. So people have sort of linked these spectacular burials like that of Sutton Hoo with these elites and have assumed that the men and women in some of these particularly spectacular furnished graves would have had more access to animals, more access to alcohol, more access to really fancy imported foods, and that we should be able to see that in their bones. But nobody had actually tested this because quite a lot of these individuals like Sutton Hoo, they don't have their skeletons left there. but some of them do. But no one's actually sort of actively gone, okay, let's match these two things up. So that's what we decided to do. So the particular methodology that I use is stable isotope analysis, and occasionally not so stable isotope analysis as well, but I'm going to be talking about the stable ones today. And the whole premise of this is you are what you eat. So by proxy, by looking at skeletal remains in the archaeological record, you can look at the food and drink people consumed and where that food and drink came from, which is also sort of when we can look at migration as well, but I won't be touching on that here. And it can tell us the difference between different types of food sources available to people and the levels of animal protein intake, which is quite handy. And depending on which bit of the skeleton you look at, you can look at different snapshots in people's lives. So if you want to look at teeth, you can have a look at childhood diet and childhood migration. My favorite tooth in particular, as an example here, is the second premolar or second molar. Your tooth enamel, the carbon in there can tell you about consumption from about 2.5 years of age up to about 8 years old. So quite a refined sort of small snapshot in somebody's childhood diet. The dentine, so from your tooth root, we can roughly get sort of about 12 to sort of 16 years of age, depending on sort of where you slice the tooth. If you want to look at long bones, so your leg bones, your arm bones, things that sort of take longer to grow and turn over, you can get a roughly sort of 20 plus year average of somebody's diet. And ribs, which is the main bit that we're going to look at today, because of the turnover of you breathing all the time until you end up in the archaeological record, this gives you roughly about 10 years of life. So if you have multiple bones and teeth from a person, you can get a really nice life history about what they're eating. And your tooth enamel is the bit that can really actually give you the mobility stuff the bones can't. So what we do to get at that is we have to make the bones squishy. Okay, we need to get rid of the mineral part of the bone, because what we're really interested in for isotopic analysis is the collagen, the fluffy stuff over there that you can see on the left of the screen. So you dissolve the bones in acid for several days until they bend. You get rid of the mineral part of that bone. And then you turn that bone into a liquid that has the collagen in it. So it's a yellowy brown bit of water, essentially. You freeze dry it to get that nice fluffy collagen, and then you put it in a mass spectrometer, and it tells you about those chemical signatures in there. And so I personally did that on just over 300 individuals during this bit of data collection, and then combined it with all of the published literature that I could find up until about 2019 in the middle of my PhD, and that gave us over 2,000 individuals to look at from early medieval England. But then if we combined that with everybody else in Northwestern Europe, that gave me over 9,000 individuals to compare to. So it's quite a large data set. When you get the data back from a mass spec, you can plot it and you get some graphs by this, and apologies, it will be a bit of a death by graph here. But essentially what you get is along the x-axis is your carbon, and the carbon can tell you about the type of ecosystem people are exploiting. So particularly in early medieval England, what we're looking at is terrestrial versus marine ecosystems. And the more negative carbon values you get, they're eating stuff from the land. So fruits, vegetables, animals, and then marine ecosystems, you go further to the right, this gives us less negative carbon values. And then you go up on the y-axis, stepwise up in the food chain. So the higher the nitrogen, the higher up in the food chain you are. And you can see that because marine ecosystems have really long food chains, from things like phytoplankton all the way up to orca, this means that you get a big shift in carbon, but also up in nitrogen. And we can then use this and plot people and see, are they sitting somewhere in the middle with those mixed marine and terrestrial diet eaters? Are they exploiting only marine resources? Are they somewhere in the terrestrial ecosystem, or do they plot somewhere sort of in a mix in between? So that's the general idea. Carbon on the x-axis, marine versus terrestrial. Going up, you're then looking at sort of where in the food chain they are. We can compare this to known current human diets. So one of my two PhD supervisors, Tamsin O'Connell, did a study back in 1999 looking at people's hair and getting them to keep diet diaries. And so they had a look and they wanted to see if you could tell apart ovo-lacto-vegetarians versus omnivores. And the answer is no. Okay, so vegans stand out, okay, because you are basically not consuming any animal protein, and all of your protein's coming from plant-based resources, and that gives you a different nitrogen value to people who are consuming any type of animal protein. And then this study was redone by some medical scientists a couple of years ago, 2019, and they got similar results. But what I basically want you to take away from this is vegans, different, lower down the food chain, as we'd expect, nitrogen-wise. And then ovo-lacto vegetarians look very, very similar to people who are eating meat, and it's all about the frequency with which you're eating that animal protein. So that animal protein doesn't have to be meat. It can be eggs, it can be dairy, it can be other byproducts, and it's more about the frequency rather than the type. So this is a limit that we have in stable isotope analysis in human remains. We can't tell if that's purely meat-based or if it's eating a lot of eggs, eating a lot of dairy. But there's other ways that we can kind of get at that. So this is kind of the takeaway here. The frequency is what we're looking at, not necessarily, and the proportional amount, not necessarily exactly what type of protein. But it all depends on what animals you're eating and what you're feeding your animals as well. So when we look at, this is the big splurge of everybody who was living from the 5th to the 8th centuries AD in southern Britain. You have to use animal baselines. So I also did the same techniques on animal bones, and that's what those lines across there are, is where wild herbivores are sitting, so things like deer, domestic herbivores, so that's an average of your sheep, your goat, and your cows in particular. Pigs sit slightly higher up because depending on what you're feeding your pigs, they're a bit more like people. You know, they'll pretty much eat anything. And it's very, very hard. Any zoo archaeologists in the room will know trying to tell apart a wild boar from a domestic pig can get quite tricky if you've got just small midden deposits. So that's kind of an averaging of both. Domestic fowl, particularly chickens, likewise, will sort of eat almost anything and can be quite carnivorous if given the chance. So they sit a little bit higher up. And then we've got a line for cats and dogs. So again, people sort of giving their scraps to their animals and them sort of foraging around for food. And fish, both freshwater and marine, sit a lot higher, again, because of those aquatic environments, there's long food chains. So if people are sort of consuming freshwater fish and marine fish, you'd expect them to be sitting higher up as well. And generally speaking, you would expect that people would be higher than the food that they're eating. So if we're looking for our super sort of meat eaters, the daily or more frequently than that, you know, having multiple meals a day with meat, we would expect them to be about 3 to 5 per meal above our sort of herbivores. And if we take the upper level, if we really want the super meat eaters, the super carnivores of the Anglo-Saxon world, they're going to be in that box. And that is not most of the people. Okay, this is kind of what I want you to get away from this is that's quite a small proportion, all things considered, especially when you're looking at a roughly about 500-year time span here. Most of those individuals don't have many grave goods. They're the darker green. Number of grave goods equals 0, so they're not our people with all the fancy stuff in their graves. They're not people like the Sutton Hoo bed burial. They're people with relatively limited funerary wealth. There are more men up here, but they're men without stuff. So again, not these sort of elites. And then down here we have our vegans, or the people who are equivocal to modern vegan sort of standards there. They're sort of from all over the place. Again, not really any patterns there in terms of their funerary wealth. And then the majority of people sort of sit somewhere in the middle with low to moderate protein intake. Tom didn't like this when I showed it to him. So he went, okay, so most people kind of sit in the middle. So how frequently are they eating this stuff? Which I just couldn't answer for him because we're having about a decade's worth of average in this. This is a decade's worth of somebody's diet that we're trying to then get how frequently are they eating this. Whereas the modern studies are done on hair, and you can take lots of fine slices down hair and get sort of monthly averages, right? So this was sort of a big problem, but we sort of worked out that broadly speaking, people are eating some, but not a lot. So what's happening with these people up in the top? Who are these biggest sort of meat and fish eaters? They're mostly people who are living in East Anglia. If anyone knows about that area in Britain, there's a lot of shade thrown on East Anglian fen dwellers even today. There's weird food chains in that area to do with the nitrogen in the soils. They're doing something different. There's different ecosystems. And so actually what I think is happening when I went hunting for very East Anglia specific animals, their animals are higher in nitrogen as well. So are they fertilizing more? Is it due to waterlogging? Something's going on at the base of the food chain. So we can basically discount anybody who's living in East Anglia because the ecosystem's different and that's what's causing them to look like they're eating a lot of meat. They probably aren't. But some of them are relying a lot on freshwater fish. And this is really highly typified by several communities that are at Ely, which today is sort of dry land, but back in this period was an island in the fens, and broadly speaking it translates to the island of the eels. And this is certainly what we're seeing with populations there. They look very, very freshwater fish heavy in their isotopic signatures. So again, parts of East Anglia, if you're in the fens, you're exploiting local resources that are freshwater fish based, and everyone else has a slightly different ecosystem sort of thing going on there. The others, all those men without grave goods, we're fairly certain are early monks. So they come from these quite interesting sites that we think are linked to early monasteries, but they're so early that we don't really have very good records, but we're assuming that's the case because they're almost entirely male-dominated cemeteries. And monks are doing something different, mostly eating fish, again, we think due to religious dietary laws, so we can discount these people again. And then some of the others who are outside East Anglia, possibly not monks, I think are probably early Vikings that just haven't had good radiocarbon dates back. And I say this due to some of them having high levels of skeletal trauma, and from their mobility signatures. So I've also done stuff from the tooth enamel for some of these individuals, and they look very, very Scandinavian and very fishy with their diets as well. So essentially, probably not very many people are actually in this high meat eating category at all. Okay, is really the upshot when we drill down into who all these people are in that top box. And this is essentially because diet changes over time. What you kind of see here is you get sort of a change in carbon, but really what I want you to get away from this is nitrogen goes up over time. And this is really the influence of Scandinavians coming in. A lot of those people are due to the Viking diaspora and then bringing their sort of fishy consumption into Britain, and changes that happen in agriculture from the 8th century AD. So essentially everyone's relatively boring pre-Viking Age. And we could kind of discount most of these meat eaters by one of two factors, the Scandinavians or a change in agriculture that happens in the 8th and 9th centuries AD. So back to that big assumption that everybody's eating a lot of meat, there's feasting, particularly with the elites. It just doesn't hold up, at least from my point of view as a bioarchaeologist. So this is where Tom got to work, and we sat down and had a look at these food rents. There's a small corpus of these texts. They've been called food rents, food renders, or fjorm, and essentially they list the ingredients that you need for an elite meal, or that's what people thought. They were things that the elites demanded from their tenants, that they had to be supplied as rent, and it was assumed that they would eat some of this because some of this goes off quite quickly, particularly if you're dragging eels out and not smoking them, that would go off quite quickly, and some other sort of things that they're demanding, ale and things like that, which before hops would go off quite quickly as well, and then the rest they would store as sort of wealth accumulation. And it has been argued by looking at some of this, so this is an example from ENA 70.1, so from 10 hides, so that's sort of 10 sort of blocks of land, it's a land mass measure. As phosphorus, so as payment, they want 10 sort of vats of honey. Tom and I went down some very deep and dark rabbit holes trying to work out exactly how big an Anglo-Saxon vat was. 300 loaves, and loaves in this period don't mean big loaves of bread, they're sort of about this size. It's an individual size sort of bun, essentially. 12 ambra, again, what on earth or how big is an ambra? You can go and look at the supplementary material for one of those papers. We did a lot of various options of ambra, and they distinguish between the different types of ale. Welsh ale, which isn't as good, apparently. 30 of clear ale, 2 full-grown cattle, or 10 wethers. So there's sort of an either-or here. 10 geese, 20 hens, 10 cheeses. Again, we went down a rabbit hole about how big is a cheese in this period and what type of milk is that made out of. Is it sheep? Is it cow? Is it goat? Because that all does have a bearing on the isotopes. An amber full of butter. How big is an amber? We're not really sure. 5 salmon, 20 pound weight. Again, exactly how much that weighed, we're not 100% sure, of fodder, and 100 eels. That's a lot of eels. If anyone is very into early medieval eels, there is a whole Twitter account dedicated to medieval eel history, and I encourage you to go and look at that. But what's quite interesting here is there is a lot of animals asked for, and yes, some of them could be kept alive and maybe dragged around the countryside, but the loaves of bread will go off very quickly. The ale will certainly go off very quickly. This is a time before hops is used. And the salmon and eels, they're not keeping them in tanks. That's very hard to do. So are they actually smoked and salted? Probably not. There's not a lot of evidence for salting, particularly in the earlier period. That comes a bit later, again from the Scandinavians. So some of this would definitely have to be eaten quite quickly. And this gave rise to the assumption in history, in early medieval history, of the farm of one night. So there has been this long debated circular argument that these texts are basically giving you the shopping list. Your king or your lord rocks up, he wants this. And you're going to feed him for one night and all of his retinue, all the people traveling around with him, and they will take some of that away with them or have it stored there with their sort of tax collector. And then they move on their merry way, and the next group have to give them the same sort of thing. And so the idea is that these people are eating this type of stuff quite regularly. But from the isotopes, I can't see that. Okay, nobody's eating this much this regularly. So the farm for one night, being a relatively regular consumption pattern for elites, we just couldn't actually see it when we were comparing the texts and the stable isotope data. So this meant that Tom and I had to do a lot of maths to kind of really convince the historians that this just doesn't hold up. So we were talking to butchers and other people, and I'm really quite annoyed that on Clarkson's farm recently they've already done all this maths for us after we'd gone and done it all ourselves and spoken to other people. How many people can a cow feed? And if you don't really preserve that meat, how quickly have you got to cook that for? A modern steer, a modern sort of big size, sort of industrial size cow will feed about 1,000 people. It's a huge amount of people, meat. Early medieval cattle, slightly smaller, but we still think several hundred individuals. And they're asking for 2 of them, plus hens, plus geese, plus sheep, plus eels, all this other stuff. So we're looking at quite a lot of meat probably consumed relatively quickly. And we just, like I said, went down all these rabbit holes of, okay, so if it feeds that many people and we've got 300 loaves and you've got this much butter that could be spread on this many loaves, and if somebody sort of lined up and you had a big spread, how does that kind of work? How can we sort of fit this all together? And then comparing it with the isotope data, how regular were these things? Because they're clearly not having it daily. They're certainly not having it in that frequent zone. So what are these events and what are these lists actually talking about? So if we go back and have a look at this again, the 300 loaves is the key bit here, we think, to unlocking the rest of this. 300 bits of bread that have to be eaten within a couple of days. So Tom, bless him, went through all of the food renders that he could find, and we did some calculations. We had a look at the dates, we had a look at where they're coming from. They're coming from mostly Kent, but also other parts of early medieval Britain. The total amount of calories these lists had in them, and what percentage of that calorie came from the animal products, versus then how many loaves are they talking about, how many bits of bread, and then for the rest of the calories, how much did that equate to a loaf, because we saw one loaf as one person, and then how much ale they're going to get, how drunk are they going to get, how big is this party, and the meat and fish per loaf, that you can kind of divvy that up, and we did sort of all of that maths there. So if we go back to our old friend ENA 70.1, what does that actually look like? So if you've got 300 loaves of about that size, and every person gets one loaf, they could have 2, but if we kind of assume that you've got one person, one loaf, they're having a lot of meat to go with that and a lot of ale to wash that down with. A lot of this is sort of back of the envelope type calculations, because modern foodstuffs have got slightly different calorie contents to what you would have had in the past, but this is like a broad approximation. You're looking at quite a lot of meat going with your loaf, which is quite surprising, and a heck of a lot of booze as well. So if we break that down to one person, so a loaf of bread, that's about 300 grams, and then you're having probably over a kilo's worth of meat per person, if this is eaten in one sitting, right? It might not have been. Honey, as well. 200 grams, we think that was probably to sweeten some of your other drinks as well. So your total food calories and your total drink calories are quite large. You can see the recommended daily intakes down there, okay? So this one lot of animal protein is more than the recommended daily intake for women currently, and close to a men's whole recommended daily intake. And they sort of say that 20 to 35% of your daily intake should be protein of any source. So this is way, way more than what people should have been having, right? Of course, they didn't have dietary intake rules back in the early Middle Ages. What this told us is this is a lot and would probably cause people some health problems if they are eating this regularly. So then Tom said to me, are you finding people with a lot of gout and issues that might be related to this? So even if we maybe aren't seeing this isotopically as some of this rich diet and having this regularly playing out in other parts of the skeleton. So I went back and had a look at everybody, and went and had a look for, love a good Georgian comic, to see if we could find a lot of gout, other related sort of disease to rich diets. It's really just not there. There were, I think, a handful of individuals out of the 2,000 that had gout. They were relatively older, we think, mostly monks again, so that's probably linked to monks having a bit too much booze, a bit too much wine. But it certainly wasn't everybody, and it certainly wasn't those individuals who do sit within that higher protein band before. So people probably just aren't having this as a super regular meal, which is good. So that went bust. So again, we sort of went back to this thing and said, okay, people are up in that zone of animal protein-heavy diets. It's looking like most of these people up there are these people with no grave goods, the people on the far left. It's mostly fishy-based consumption, and the vegans down the bottom are relatively rare. So where does this actually sort of leave us with all of this? So I found no link between sort of burial wealth, the amount of stuff in your grave, and diet, at least in terms of what we can see through isotopes. They might have been getting different cuts of meat and served in different ways, but certainly as that works out in proportions of your diet, there's no link there. There's no link between the dietary isotopes and the skeletal pathologies, and certainly no link between the skeletal pathologies and burial wealth either. So that's kind of out of all these, old, fat, wealthy people. It just didn't seem to be a thing in this period. But the diet is very chronological and regional. So East Anglia doing something completely different. By the time you hit the Viking Age, there's different types of food available and different ways of thinking about food. But from the end of the Roman period up to just before the Viking Age, everyone's pretty much eating the same thing. And it's relatively low protein intake, mostly terrestrial-based food. So yeah, there's just none of these sort of meat-heavy individuals. And from the economic history sort of perspective, the food rents in Fayum are very formulaic. If you go back to that sort of big table I had of all of them, they're almost all asking for the exact same thing, maybe in slightly different amounts, but that is generally proportional to the amount of bread that they're asking for. So there's some sort of cultural memory here of this is what you ask for and this is what you have. So what does that actually then equate to? What are these things? The amount of food and meat is far too much for anyone to be eating regularly, especially when we compare it back to the skeletal pathologies and the isotopes. And seeing as most of the food is highly perishable, it needs to be consumed quickly. And it's too much food. If there's 300 loaves, even if you were to say maybe everybody got 2 or 3 loaves, that's still about 100 people. That is probably not the elite and their immediate retinue. There's other people at these events and eating this food. So what are we talking about here? And this is what Tom and I came up with. So if you kind of think about modern political fundraising events where there's a big spread on, everyone's there, you're schmoozing everybody, you're trying to say to your community, vote for me, have me as your leader. Let's put on a big shindig, let's slaughter that cow. That's what we're kind of looking at here. They were traveling around, they were demanding this, but it probably wasn't the farm for one night, it wasn't a super regular thing, it was a very special event to bring the community together. And given the sort of population sizes that we think we have in this period, that's going to be quite a large community coming together and eating this food, and not just the elites, it's your everyday free people as well. And when you think about the economics of these animals and how special they were to slaughter and to take out of sort of use in the community, that's quite a big thing to do, so it had to be a special occasion. In the earlier period, we think this is very much about sort of community building, about kingship, about sort of asserting power and keeping that power. But by the time you get to sort of the 10th and 11th centuries, this seems to be for special feast days and linked in with the Christian calendar as well, because you get the monasteries and nunneries asking for these linked to certain special feast days. So we think this then kind of became part of, okay, so if we're celebrating the death of so-and-so as sort of a commemorative event, we're going to throw one of these things because this is what we used to do and this is what we continue to do. And this is the formula for what we have to eat on these days. And we think this actually holds up because there's been some really exciting archaeology recently throughout the country showing these huge roasting pits, these whopping great big things with all these burnt bits of stone. And previously people just went, oh, I don't know what that is. And Cotswold Archaeology and a couple of the other commercial firms had the genius idea to ask my colleague Julie Dunn, who's a specialist in lipid residue analysis, so looking at fats. She usually looks at pots. They asked her to have a look at these stones and see what type of biomolecular stuff stuck to them. And she went, all right, okay, I'll look at a whole bunch of burnt stones. Sure, if you're going to pay me, why not? And they found a lot of animal fat. These are big barbecue pits. Okay, and they're about the size of a cow. Sometimes it's the size of a sheep, depending on where you are, and it fits with ruminant adipose fat, so herbivores, and their carcass fat. It's not dairy, it's not non-ruminant, so we're not looking at pigs and stuff. They're roasting big herbivores in these pits. So if you kind of think like when you go down to a beach and you sort of dig it out and you put hot stones in there and then you cover it back over and you leave the meat to kind of sit and cook, that's what they're doing on a large scale, and whole animal by the size of these things. So it's really kind of, Tom and I were so excited. We're like, yes, this backs up the barbecue idea. And so this is what we think they're doing. They're slaughtering one of these animals. It's a big event. Everybody comes together. You build a pit. You slaughter the animal. You put it in. You leave it to roast. You maybe prepare all the rest of the meals. You get together. You have your meeting, your witten, your other type of sort of political and legal chat that you need to do. And then you crack out all that ale. You open the pit and you start eating the roast carcass. So were they vegetarian? No. I think what I had to sort of keep on saying to the media time and time again, there's this idea of sort of modern vegetarianism, which just wasn't, a thing back in the past. I think most of us in the room would understand that, but lots of people went, oh no, well, they're not eating much meat, so are they vegetarian? It's like, well, no, they were slaughtering these animals, but it's a very different idea and a very different socioeconomic model of how you relate to your animals and their use in the community and what brings people together for these events. So they would be functionally vegetarian, or as I think the Daily Mail said, flexitarian, but that doesn't come with the modern ideas that we have for diet. It was far more sort of economic. And when we look at the text here are some sort of calendars from the period. It's all very tied into the agricultural year. So the other thing to stress is that meat and certain animal byproducts are not available all year round. So no wonder people aren't eating this super regularly, because the animals are going to be more useful and you need them to breed and you slaughter them at different times of year, so it's not always going to be available. Dairy is not continually available. Eggs are not continually available. There's ways that you can try to preserve these things, but it's a very cyclical sort of nature to food consumption. So they weren't heavy meat eaters because that made no sense, economically or environmentally at the time. So just to kind of bring it all back to that is, basically before the Vikings rock up and bring all their love of cod and herring from Scandinavia, most Anglo-Saxons or early medieval people living in southern Britain only really ate meat at very special occasions, and due to the nature of the agricultural year, fruits, vegetables, cereals, and whatever animal byproducts were available seasonally were the mainstays of their diet. We are very much looking at people sort of eating stews and things that were sort of slow cooked over a fire, lathered on bread, and you ate what was available throughout the year. This sort of assumption that archaeologists and historians have had about this period, about these people having the farm for one night, going around demanding these big feasts, just can't be backed up when you do all of the maths. And what the texts are actually sort of dictating are shopping lists for special feasts, not just what your lord needed and wanted to keep him and his retinue going. And the fact that this sort of persists and this formula persists for several hundred years in the texts, I think really sort of backs this up. This is a special event and this is what you have. And you then adjust it to the size of your community. And generally speaking, in the earlier texts, this is about 300 people, possibly more, which is really exciting to think about. People are coming from quite a large way away to sit by these big roasting pits, talk to each other, talk to their lord, and what that means for community dynamics is really quite exciting. So this tells us quite a lot about early kingship and what that meant. So it isn't them just demanding these rents. It's about sort of community engagement, for want of a better word, about stakeholder engagement, about bringing people together and being seen and feasting together, and the sort of community aspect that brings. I think we can all sort of imagine Christmas, special events in our lives. It's all often, in most cultures, food that brings you together for those sort of big events. And it was certainly the same back then. This is what we're looking at. And that's quite exciting. And it makes a lot of sense, but I think it's something, one of those things in archaeohistorical sort of work where people just make this one assumption, back in the 19th century, and it carries through. But the economic importance of animals and what they meant to the community is really quite sort of backed up by the human isotopic data, which is quite nice. The animals could be used for traction, they could be used for wool, leather, milk, so many other things. So why would you slaughter them really early on if you didn't have to? You slaughtered them for very special events only, and then you brought everyone together because it's a lot to eat. And that brings the community together. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you. That was fascinating insight, and I think also a good reminder, just the significance of understanding food for social history, and that dynamic of, when you summed it up, of how it was all related to the way that society was functioning. We do have time for one or two questions, if you don't mind. For the video recording, I will repeat any questions from the floor, but if anyone does have any questions, you were first, sir. So the questions in regard to food rent.
So that's really Tom's domain rather than mine. But that's sort of what we're thinking is maybe it was annual or maybe twice yearly, something like that, because certainly in terms of the archaeological evidence, it's going to be infrequent from what I'm seeing from people's diets. So this is sort of, I think, 2.0 from Tom's perspective. He's going to be looking at exactly how regularly they thought this was, because to fight against the farm for one night idea has been quite controversial. But yeah, annual or possibly a couple of times yearly. So just to repeat for the recording, it's a question about the skeletal samples and if they're actually representative of the communities, because the archaeological record is biased. So yes, they're almost entirely from cemeteries. There are some that are from lone burials that are meant to be quite high status. So while Sutton Hoo doesn't have his bones remaining due to diagenesis, we've got, so for instance, one of the sites that I looked at, Fingalsham, I sampled over 50% of the individuals, and we've got the very high status to the low. So we've got some of these communities where you've got people in these spectacular burial mounds, not quite as lovely as Sutton Hoo, but who do have quite a lot of burial wealth invested in them and are sort of placed funerary-wise in a very special part of the community. And then I tried to sample individuals who aren't, who are on the peripheries, who are in other places who've got no grave goods. And that was why I also wanted to do this sort of meta-analysis bit of this and get all the other data that was published to try to balance out sort of my sampling selection for my PhD versus everything else. So I think we do actually have a pretty good cross-section, but whether or not we actually have the royals is the question, right? Because until we get to that 7th century grand display of places like Sutton Hoo, the pretty well princely burial that's in Essex, you get people with more stuff, but are they the top, or are they buried somewhere else? And what Tom and I are really waiting on, and we hope they'll publish, is the funerary chests in Winchester Cathedral have been cracked open and analysed. So these are known Wessex royalty, and the radiocarbon date seems to suggest that they could be people like Alfred the Great, but they haven't published the data yet. So I think we do have most cross-sections of society, but do we actually have the top? Unclear, but I think from some of the big cemeteries, probably. Hopefully that kind of thing. Yeah, so just for the recording, it's a question about who's probably at these feasts, because it's a lot of people. Like, what strata of society are there? Is that kind of, have I summarized the question? So we think with that amount of people, so to kind of link it back to what Denise was asking about there, about the size of these cemeteries, some of them do get quite large, but often we've got sort of a cap of around 500 to 600 people over several hundred years buried in some of these big cemeteries. So if you do the maths about how frequently people were dying, you're looking at a community that's a lot smaller probably than 300 people at any given time. So we think what's happening at these events is there are some of the elite, and that would have been quite a small section of society, you know, the top couple of percent. And then they're inviting lots of people from multiple communities, from the whole sort of surrounding area, who probably had to travel a relatively sort of long distance if you're thinking about walking, and people not having necessarily horses and things to take them. So we think it's most stratas of society, and the slaves were probably there as well. This is a slave-owning society. Whether or not they were eating this and where the slaves are buried, that's another question. But we think it's everybody, right? From the king and the lord all the way down to the peasants who are at these events, which is quite exciting. Absolutely, yeah. It seems like everybody was there at these big things. Yeah, it's just so much food. It has to be quite a lot of people. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about how many of these sort of texts are actually about, and have we come across other things like housekeepers' lists? So I'll go back to the list of all the ones that we've got there. So there's not many. This is before the Norman Conquest or just around the Norman Conquest. So there's not a lot of them because writing just wasn't as regular. And so housekeepers' lists and things we don't have them. If they did exist, if they were literate, we don't have that evidence. So there's some big gaps here. These are pretty much all royal or ecclesiastical based. So it's kind of what the monasteries want, or it's what the king has decided to write down and keep for posterity. So Ina and Offa, the first two there, those are kings. And then you can see some others are archbishops and things. So we're missing what a daily sort of shopping list from anybody else would be, yeah.
So we're going to have time for yours and then the back.
So other sorts of evidence going forward, what we'd like, or yeah, I'd really like the stuff from the burial chests at Winchester, because if they're known royals or at least elites, because by the looks of it, they haven't actually swapped out other people, which quite often happens with reliquaries. They do a bit of bone swapping in the Middle Ages. That would be really lovely. The next step that we're sort of looking at is doing proteomic analysis and genetic analysis in people's dental calculus. So fossilized tooth gunk is a really great record for what people are eating. And that can actually give you very specific things about dairy, exactly what meats and stuff are fossilized in people's teeth. So that's kind of the next step, is to get some really actual known royals and then do some of that work to have a look at the difference between cows, sheep, what type of actual plants are fossilized in people's mouths. And the hair, well, if there was hair, that would be lovely, but it doesn't. No, sadly not. Not for this period. If there is any early medieval sort of mummification, I would love to know, because that would be great. But yeah.
And final question.
Yeah, really great question. So the question was about did people sort of die from famine, starvation, and can we find pathologies related to nutritional deficiencies? Yes, and from the historical records, we know that there were famines that happened. And the other thing that, just for the simplicity of this talk, I didn't get into is your nitrogen can also be high if you're under nutritional stress, because your body starts to eat itself and you then are essentially a cannibal. So the other question about some of those people who are very high nitrogen is, are they actually starving? And this has been proven with Irish famine cemeteries doing the same techniques that I do on these known populations. And you can also then see when they then recover from the famine, if you get really good incremental denting, so tiny slices down your tooth, where it can give you that time series. So yes, and goiters and things, it's hard in the skeletal record to get to some of that, but anemia and things certainly do show up in the bones if it's been severe enough. So that's something that we're looking at as well, but there's not a lot of that actually. So even though we know people were dying in famines from their historical record, some of it seems to have killed them before it got to their bones, because it has to be quite severe and quite long lasting for it to sort of be fossilized in your skeletal material. So yes, but not heaps of them. But some of those high nitrogen people could be starving. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for some wonderful questions as well. Sam, I know your time in Sydney has been very short, so thank you for squeezing an hour in for us. Can I ask everyone to thank Dr. Sam Leggett? And I'll invite guests to enjoy the museum this afternoon, and Sounds Cafe is open if you're looking for lunch or a coffee or a cheeky glass of wine. Thank you.